Today, I'm going to walk you through how to master global questions in LSAT reading comp. These are the ones that ask you about the main point, the primary purpose, the organization of the passage, and sometimes even what the best title would be. First, for those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. Now, global questions in LSAT reading comp are the ones that test your understanding of the passage as a whole. They might ask, what's the main point? What's the author's primary purpose? How is the passage organized? And what is an appropriate title for the passage? These are some of the most common questions in LSAT reading comp. And so when you approach a reading comp passage, before anything else, determine the topic. What is it all about? Pretty simple, right? But you'd be surprised at how often people get lost in the details. But the thing is, if you don't get the main idea, if you don't know what the topic is, you're not really going to get anything about the passage, right? And so you want to get the big picture to start with. Then secondly, you want to understand better how the passage is laid out. How is it organized? Is the passage presenting a problem followed by a solution? Is it comparing and contrasting two different ideas? Or maybe it's laying out a cause and effect relationship. You also want to spot the key sentences that summarize the author's opinion or summarize the key thesis of the passage. You want to hone in on those. If you're into highlighting and underlining, you may want to use those tools for those key sentences, or maybe note them on your scratch paper. And of course, you want to paraphrase the main idea in your own words to help you solidify your understanding. And then when you go into the questions, if you see a main idea question, you'll already have your pre-phrase laid out for you, and that'll make it a lot easier to spot it in LSAC's wording, which is definitely not going to be as nice as your wording of the main idea. Now let's look at an example here. What if we had a passage on the LSAT about the impact of remote work on urban development? The author in this passage might be discussing the shift from a traditional office space to a remote setup and how this trend is influencing urban planning and real estate markets. The first step here would be identify the main topic. In this case, it is of course the influence of remote work on urban development. Then you want to understand how the passage is laid out. In this case, it would be a cause and effect framework. The cause would be the increase in remote work. The effect would be changes in urban planning and effects on real estate markets. Now that we have step one, identified the main topic, and step two, determined how the passage is organized, we want to, step three, spot the key sentences in the passage. And so if we had a sentence saying something like, for example, the rise of remote work is redefining the purpose of urban spaces, that would be a great sentence to hone in on because it's summarizing the author's key point. Or if we had a sentence saying something like, this shift requires a reevaluation of how cities are planned and developed, that would once again be a great sentence to hone in on because it would summarize one of the author's main points. Now, step four, you want to paraphrase the idea here in your own words. You might say something to yourself like, the passage argues that as remote work becomes more common, it significantly impacts urban development, requiring changes in city planning. You could then take a more brief version of that in your scratch paper, saying something like remote work, arrow, impact urban development, or remote work, arrow, change city planning. Now, step five, we want to go ahead and pre-phrase the correct answer. We can predict that the correct answer here is going to mention the effect of remote work on cities and urban planning. So if we had a question stem asking us something like, which of the following best expresses the main point of the passage? And we had five choices, one of them saying A, remote work has no significant impact on urban areas, we would of course knock that one out. It directly contradicts the passage. Or choice B, the increase in remote work is leading to substantial changes in urban development and city planning. I love that one. It lines up really well as a good paraphrase of our preface, so we'll keep it for now. Choice C, real estate markets are unaffected by shifts in work environments. That would be knocked out because, again, it contradicts the passage. D, traditional office spaces remain central to urban development. It kind of goes against the passage, although not as directly as the other wrong answers, but is, of course, ignoring the impact of remote work, so I'd knock it out. And choice E, urban development dictates the prevalence of remote work trends. This here is interesting because it's reversing the cause and effect. Remote work is changing urban development, not that urban development is changing remote work. So in this case, the correct answer here would be B, the paraphrase of our pre-phrase, our prediction, the idea here being that remote work is, of course, changing urban development. Now, let's talk about common traps in LSAT answer choices. Some answers are going to be too narrow and focus too much on a specific detail, or others might be so broad that they miss the main point altogether. LSAT reading comp passages are often a bit more nuanced than that. You also want to avoid choices that are out of scope entirely, that introduce information not mentioned in the passage, and you also want to avoid choices that contain the opposite of what the passage was communicating, like we saw in those examples I gave you before. Now, of course, global LSAT reading comp questions are just one part of succeeding on LSAT reading comp and on the LSAT in general. And so if you'd like my help with anything else LSAT-wise, or you're still struggling with global reading comp questions, my team and I would be glad to help you out. At LSAT Unplugged, we have multiple classes on LSAT reading comp every single week in our small group programs. And of course, in our one-on-one coaching, you can focus exclusively on LSAT reading comp or whatever else you would like. You have the power to set the agenda. We personalize our programs for the individual student. If you'd like my help on your journey to scoring a 170 or above, my team and I would be glad to support you. You can check out the links below to book a call with me and my team. Now, if you want to improve at LSAT reading comp, here are a couple of quick tips before we wrap up. First, practice active reading. As you read the passage, engage with it. Ask yourself questions. What is the main point of this paragraph? What is the purpose of this sentence in the context of the passage as a whole? Take some brief notes if you find it helpful. You might want to jot down the main idea of each paragraph. It helps you retain the information. Also, think about how you're allocating your time. I typically recommend spending 2.5 to 3 minutes on your initial read of the passage so that you'll have sufficient time to solve the questions associated. And of course, stay calm. Even if a passage seems difficult, don't get bogged down in the details. Focus on the big picture, the main idea. And again, if you'd like my help, feel free to reach out. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.